The moment the blue lights flashed behind her, Camille Foster already knew this wouldn't end like the other times. And that was the most terrifying part, how familiar it all felt. A successful black woman driving alone at night in a clean car, wearing a tailored blazer and pearls that still shimmered faintly under the street lamps. And none of that mattered. Her law degree, her courtroom wins, her unshakable reputation, none of it could shield her now from what she saw in that rearview mirror. A cop stepping out slowly, hand on his holster, with the look of a man searching for a reason. It was supposed to be a simple Thursday evening. Camille had just walked out of the 12th Circuit Courthouse, her heels echoing off marble as she clutched her latest win, a case that had nearly broken her spirit. She had defended a young girl against a housing discrimination case and won. Justice, real and raw, she should have been celebrating. Instead, she loosened her collar, tossed her case file on the passenger seat, and drove off into the quiet night, jazz humming softly from the speakers. But as she turned into the affluent Brookwood neighborhood, the air shifted. The streets were too empty, too still. She noticed the cruiser a few blocks back, following her too precisely, changing lanes when she did, slowing down when she slowed, and then the lights, no siren, just enough to say "I see you." She exhaled slowly and pulled over, hands still on the wheel. She waited, 10 seconds, 20, then 30. Finally, he approached Officer Ryan McConnell. Tall, late 40s, with a sharp jawline and eyes that didn't blink much, he leaned into the window without even greeting her. "Is this your vehicle?" His voice was flat, but it carried a layer of suspicion, not the kind built on facts, but the kind forged over years of assumptions. Camille kept her expression neutral. "Yes, officer, it's registered to me. Where you headed tonight?" He asked next, his eyes darting around the interior of her car. "Home," she replied simply. She didn't offer more. She didn't need to, but Ryan didn't like that. He didn't like her calm, didn't like her clipped, confident tone. In his mind, it wasn't compliance, it was defiance. She was to put together, to direct, to unfazed, license and registration, he said, but the edge in his voice tightened. As she reached slowly, visibly into her purse, his hand moved instantly to his gun. "Hands where I can see them." He barked. Camille froze. The moment stretched. She turned her head carefully, hands raised, every part of her trained. "To survive this moment, I'm reaching for my license," she said clearly. But it didn't matter, out of the vehicle. Now, his voice didn't shake, it sliced. She obeyed. Slowly, silently. She stepped out, heels touching the pavement, with quiet finality. Before she could speak again, he spun her around, yanked her arms behind her back, and slammed her against the hood. Cold steel, breath knocked from her chest. The cuffs snapped tight around her wrists. "You fit the description," he muttered. Almost like a script. "What description?" she asked calmly. "Driving while black?" But he didn't answer. Traffic rolled past. One car slowed. A pedestrian paused. Someone was filming. She could feel the camera in the air like heat. But Ryan didn't care. He shoved her into the back of his squad car like she was an inconvenience. As he drove, he said nothing. Camille didn't protest. She didn't cry or plead. She just stared at the back of his head, calm and steady, calculating everything. From the time of the stop to the number on his badge, she wasn't afraid of him. She was documenting him. T the precinct. He brought her in without process. No booking, no Miranda rights. He didn't log her arrest. He simply placed her in the holding room, shut the door, and walked away like he'd done something noble. The station was dimly lit, quiet except for the faint buzz of a vending machine and the hum of overhead lights. Camille sat down on the bench, adjusted the cuffs behind her back, and waited. Her face was composed, her heart steady. She knew this game, but what he didn't know was that he'd just arrested the state lawyer for civil oversight and police conduct. She'd memorized every file on misconduct, every internal complaint. She'd seen his name once before, just once. It was buried, sealed, redacted, but she never forgot it. Ryan McConnell. She had reviewed a decade-old case from Clay County involving the shooting of an unarmed teen. The officer's name was hidden, but now she was sure, this man, this same man. And he had no idea who he just cuffed. So she waited. waited for the moment he'd realize, waited for the silence to collapse under the weight of truth, because Camille Foster hadn't just been arrested, she'd been underestimated, and that was the last mistake Officer McConnell would ever make. The moment Camille Foster crossed the threshold of the precinct in handcuffs, the atmosphere shifted like a ripple across still water. It wasn't loud, it was the absence of noise that said everything. Conversations died mid-sentence. Fingers paused over keyboards. Even the old coffee machine stopped humming, as if the building itself sensed something was wrong. Officer Ryan McConnell didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. He marched forward like he had before, the smell of authority clinging to him. Like cheap aftershave, Camille, on the other hand, moved with calm precision. Her hands were cuffed behind her back, wrists sore, but her chin stayed high. She took in every detail: the badge numbers on the wall, the clock above dispatch, the looks on the officers' faces. Some were indifferent, others unsure, but not one of them intervened. To them, she was just another suspect, another late night detainment that wouldn't make it past the holding log. She was the only one who knew the truth, that this wouldn't be forgotten by morning, that this wasn't just about a traffic stop. This was about exposure and retribution. Ryan led her past the booking desk without stopping. No fingerprints, no photograph, no paperwork. He didn't even bother logging the time of arrest. He opened the door to the holding room, a dim, gray space with a metal bench and nothing else, and pushed it open without looking at her. "Sit tight," he muttered. Then he turned to leave. "No phone call?" she asked, her voice sharp but even. He stopped. "You think you get rights after mouthing off to a cop?" he said, smirking. "You're lucky I don't keep you here." All night, Camille tilted her head. "I'd like to call the Attorney General's office." Her voice was clear, direct, and for the first time that evening, Ryan hesitated. A young officer behind the front desk, Officer Calloway, new on the force, observant, looked up sharply. He heard that name: Attorney General, not public defender, not cousin, Attorney General's office. He frowned, then typed something into the internal directory, just to be sure. What came back made his stomach flip. Camille Foster, Assistant State Attorney for Civil Oversight, appointed 2 years ago, known for dismantling the cover-up of the Eastfield jail scandal. He stood quickly, knocking over his chair. "Wait," he whispered under his breath, his voice too soft to carry across the room. But someone else heard it. Another officer leaned in. "What did you say?" Calloway didn't answer, but now 3 more officers were staring at the holding room door. Whispers moving like static down the corridor. Ryan hadn't noticed yet. He was still trying to decide whether or not to hand her a phone. Camille sat down slowly on the bench, cuffs still behind her, eyes level with his. "I'd recommend you make the call, Officer McConnell," she said, voice low and sharp like a scalpel. "Before this goes somewhere you can't follow." Ryan crossed his arms, a smug smile returning to his face. "You think you're someone important?" She didn't blink. "I think you're about 10 minutes from ending your career." He laughed, loud, but it didn't reach his eyes, and something in his gut, something primal, began to churn. "You're bluffing," he said. "You're just another mouthy. I know what you did in Clay County," she said, cutting him off, her voice like ice. "I know about Andre Whitaker. I've seen the sealed file." The color drained from his face. It was like someone hit a light switch behind his eyes. For a second, he didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared at her like she'd spoken a word he'd buried in concrete years ago. I don't know what you're talking about," he said quickly, but his voice cracked. Camille leaned forward, her wrists still locked behind her, but her presence suddenly towering over him. The missing dashcam, the vanished statement, the internal review that never happened. She gave a half smile. "The one thing you didn't erase was your name on the supplemental intake log. I flagged it last month during a statewide audit. And then tonight, imagine my surprise when I see the same name pulling me out of my car with no cause." Ryan backed a step. You don't have proof." Camille leaned back against the cold wall, calm again. "No," she said, "you gave me that yourself. The moment you failed to read my rights, log my arrest, and bring in a supervisor." The door behind Ryan creaked open. Officer Calloway stepped in, his face pale. "Sir," he said cautiously, there's someone on the line." From the AG's office, they're asking why Camille Foster hasn't checked in after her court session. Ryan turned, stiff. Tell them they already know, Calloway interrupted, his voice firmer now. They said if she's in our custody without legal cause, we're in violation. Ryan looked at Camille, now suddenly seeing her not as a suspect, but as what she truly was, a mirror, a witness, and worse, a prosecutor. The chief of police arrived 20 minutes later. He didn't walk in with authority. He ran, still in golf clothes, face flushed, eyes wide with dread. Where is... she? He snapped. Holding room 2, someone said. Ryan brought her in, said she was uncooperative. She's the damn oversight lawyer. The chief growled, get her out of there now. By the time he burst into the room, Emile was already uncuffed. Officer Calloway had done it quietly, without instruction. She was rubbing her wrists calmly. The chief apologized in a rush. Offered her water, a lawyer, a car home. She didn't accept any of it. Instead, she looked at Ryan standing stiffly in the corner, exposed, and said, "You never thought someone like me could hold the mirror back up, did you?" The whole station was silent now. Officers weren't whispering anymore. They were watching, some with confusion, some with shame, and a few with quiet hope. Something had shifted. The badge didn't feel so bulletproof anymore. Not when. The law itself had just walked in. In heels, with bruised wrists and eyes full of fire. Long before the lights flashed behind Camille Foster's car, long before Officer Ryan McConnell slapped cold cuffs around her wrists, there was a night in Clay County that should have ended his career, but instead became the cornerstone of his silence. It was 10 years ago, just after dusk, on a back road lined with pine trees and poverty, where the only witnesses were shadows and the law had no leash. The report said a young black teen, Andre Whitaker, had reached for something. That officer McConnell, fearing for his life, discharged his weapon, once, twice, 3 times. Andre never made it home. His backpack was found beside his body. Inside it were school books and a sandwich. The official word was self-defense. The district cleared McConnell in under 48 hours. Case closed, no footage, no dashcam, just a conveniently missing statement from a nearby driver who had stopped to call 911, a witness who later said he never got a follow-up. The file was sealed. The department moved McConnell quietly out of Clay County and into the city, where complaints were more frequent but harder to prove. And so he stayed unpunished, unchanged until a name reappeared on a document he thought no one would ever read again. Officer Ryan McConnell Incident, Whitaker, a status, justified. Camille had seen it during a statewide internal audit only months before. She was reviewing sealed misconduct reports flagged for conflict of interest. The name didn't jump out at first. But the case did. A minor shot during a stop, no footage, no disciplinary action, and then the supplemental log buried deep in a PDF showed the responding officer, McConnell. She remembered staring at it for a long time, something cold building in her gut. She filed it, quietly, made a copy, watermarked it, and waited, because lawyers know if you wait long enough, the truth always circles back. And now, 10 years later, that file was sitting in a flash drive at the bottom of her purse, while the man who pulled that trigger stood frozen in a precinct hallway, watching his history catch up to him in heels and a courtroom smile. Ryan's hands trembled slightly as Camille stood across from him in the briefing room, no longer in cuffs, no longer invisible. She held a folder now unmarked, sealed with a red clip, and when she placed it on the table, it landed with the weight of a decade. "This is everything," she said softly. "Every report you thought was hidden. Every page you thought would never be read again." Ryan glanced at the folder like it was radioactive. You went digging?" He whispered. "It was part of my job," she replied. "But what I found that was personal." The chief stood nearby, unsure whether to intervene or listen. He listened. Camille opened the folder with slow precision, revealing a timeline of the Clay County incident, including the name of the original witness, the call log that was never filed, and a subpoena request that was mysteriously withdrawn 2 days after McConnell's clearance. "This," she said, tapping the page, "is the moment you became untouchable. This is the lie you built your badge on." Ryan's face was pale. "I didn't write those reports. That was the department, but you fired the gun. She interrupted. You watched them bury it, and then you used that silence like armor. He tried to speak again, but the words tangled in his throat. Camille didn't need him to admit anything. She already had enough. What she wanted now was for him to feel it. You thought tonight was about a traffic stop, she said. But it wasn't. It was about the weight of what you carry. You arrested me because I didn't flinch, because I looked like someone you couldn't control, because deep down you knew who I was even if you didn't remember from a file. Ryan backed into a chair and sat, his knees weak. The chief approached, his voice low. Is all this verified? Camille handed him a flash drive. It's already backed up to 3 secure servers and scheduled for release to the Dodge by morning. The chief exhaled like a man watching a building collapse in slow motion. You're making this public? She didn't answer immediately. She looked back at Ryan, who now looked nothing like the man who had pulled her over. He looked small, diminished, human. I don't need to, she said finally. He already did. The chief closed his eyes. Jesus. Ryan tried one. Last defense a whisper. You don't know what it was like back then, that town. They wanted a scapegoat. I just did my job. Camille's eyes turned cold. Your job was to serve and protect, not execute and erase. She reached for her folder and stood. You didn't just arrest the wrong person tonight, Officer McConnell. You unsealed the past. As she walked out of the room, the silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was reverent. Officers moved aside, eyes down. Some of them had worked with McConnell for years. They'd seen his temper, his shortcuts, but they'd never seen anyone hold him accountable until now. Camille passed through the precinct like a storm in a silk blouse, quiet, calculated, and utterly unstoppable. Outside, the first camera crew was arriving. The whispers were becoming calls. The file was already spreading, and Ryan McConnell sat alone at the table, staring at the folder like it was a mirror. The secret he thought no one knew had never left. It had just been waiting for her. The air inside the precinct had thickened with a kind of tension no one could name, not fear, not guilt, not yet justice, but something in between. When Chief Gerald Simmons walked through the main entrance with his jacket half-buttoned and his eyes wild with panic, the silence was instant. His boots clapped against the tiled floor with authority, but it was a hollow sound now, no longer commanding, more like desperation in uniform. Word had reached him before the official call, a state lawyer arrested. No cause, no paperwork. No camera footage filed, but what chilled him most wasn't that Camille Foster had been detained, it was who had detained her, Ryan McConnell. That name brought weight, and not the good kind. The chief had heard things, whispers, half complaints. Informal warnings that never quite made it into writing. But now it was too late for doubt. Camille had already made the call, and by the time the chief entered the holding corridor, she was no longer in cuffs. Officer Calloway had uncuffed her minutes before, his hands shaking slightly, but his conscience still enough to do what the badge required. She stood tall, dusting off her blazer as if she were leaving a courtroom, not a jail cell. Her expression was composed, but her presence burned, not angry, not wounded, just certain, the kind of certainty that can silence a room, the kind that says, I know something you all tried to forget. Legal advisors arrived, first suits, briefcases, urgency in every footstep. Then came internal affairs, 2 prosecutors, a state ethics officer. They filed in one after the other like a parade of consequence. The precinct's back hallway, once home to vending machines and faded plaques, now looked like a war room. The chief approached Camille, clearing his throat like a man trying to perform damage control with a fire hose. Miss Foster, he said, voice taut, on behalf of the department, but she raised a hand, silencing him. Then, slowly, she stepped forward into the center of the hallway, loud enough now that every officer nearby could hear her, and said, This isn't just about me. This is about how many people you've let him do this to. Her voice echoed. It didn't shout, it didn't shake, but it landed like a verdict. Eyes turned toward Ryan McConnell, who now sat in a plastic chair near the break room, his face flushed, his posture collapsing under the weight of exposure. He didn't speak, didn't move. He was a man unraveling, thread by thread, while his world watched. Officer Calloway, still clutching the cuff keys in one hand, took a shaky step forward. His voice was soft at first. "I've seen him do it before," he said. "Not like this, but like this. Same pattern. No report, just people getting pulled out of cars for looking wrong." A few other officers looked at each other. One nodded almost imperceptibly. Another took out a phone and began scrolling through old complaint logs. The truth was surfacing, one whisper at a time. Camille turned to the chief. "You know how many of his body cams go missing after a stop?" She asked. 12 in 3 years, and you kept promoting him." The chief looked like he'd aged 5 years in 10 minutes. He said nothing. One of the prosecutors stepped beside Camille and opened a manila envelope. Inside were printed logs, officer review histories, and a flash drive containing the Clay County file, the one no one was supposed to see, but now it was evidence. "And not just for Ryan, for the department that let it rot. We're initiating a departmental inquiry," the prosecutor said, effective immediately. Internal affairs officers stepped forward toward Ryan, who blinked as if coming out of a trance. "Wait," he started. "You can't. You're being placed on administrative leave pending full investigation," the lead agent said. "Badge, weapon." Now, the words hit like stone. Ryan stood reluctantly, fumbling at his belt as he unfastened the weapon holster and placed it gently on the table. Then the badge, his final shield, trembled in his palm before he set it down. His career had just cracked open. Camille didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply turned, walked past him, and picked up her belongings. From a locker officer, Calloway had retrieved her phone, her keys, her purse. Then she walked back toward the exit with steps that said, "I came in under arrest. I'm leaving in control." The officers around her didn't stop her, didn't speak. Some looked away, some watched with silent respect. And as she reached the door, she paused, not for effect, not for drama, but for meaning. Then she said quietly, "Next time, listen before you draw your weapon." She didn't have to say who she was talking to. She opened the precinct door into the warm evening light and stepped out, but she didn't walk out alone, because behind her came the truth. It followed in the form of paperwork, testimony, digital files. It followed in the hearts of officers who had stayed silent too long. It followed in the shift, subtle but certain, that moved through that precinct like a wind before a storm. That night, Camille went home. She took off her shoes, fed her cat, answered to missed calls, and then she sat quietly at her dining table with a glass of wine and opened her laptop. The folder marked Whitaker plus McConnell had already synced to the cloud. She clicked one file, the body cam log index, reviewed it, then clicked send and addressed it to the Dodge, the ACLU, and the Office of State Oversight. One email, 3 attachments. The truth was no longer sealed. It was free, and Camille Foster, the woman who walked into a precinct in cuffs, had just started a reckoning. The courtroom pulsed with the kind of energy usually reserved for verdicts in history books, a space where air itself felt heavy, where every seat was filled, and every breath seemed to pause before being released. Cameras flashed from behind. Frosted glass, reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens frozen above notepads, as if afraid to miss a single word. But the woman at the center of it all, Camille Foster, wasn't afraid. She didn't just belong in that courtroom. She commanded it. Dressed in a deep charcoal blazer, a single gold pin gleaming above her heart, she rose from the witness stand with the slow, deliberate power of someone who had waited her entire life to speak truth where silence had reigned. Across the aisle, behind the defense table, Officer Ryan McConnell sat with shoulders slumped and eyes dark, barely able to meet her gaze. His lawyer whispered furiously in his ear, but he didn't seem to hear. The man who once wielded a badge like a sword now looked like a man counting the seconds until the floor caved in. And in many ways it already had. Days earlier, the story had broken like glass across the national media. State attorney illegally arrested by officer with prior shooting tied to sealed case. The headlines didn't just expose a bad arrest, they unearthed a buried past. The Clay County incident had been reopened. Internal affairs swept through Ryan's previous cases like a floodlight through a haunted house. Files were pulled. Witnesses recalled, body cam records once labeled corrupted suddenly restored. It wasn't just about Camille anymore. It was about every person before her who didn't have a law degree, who didn't have a platform, who didn't survive the night they were pulled over. The courtroom had become more than a legal chamber, it had become a reckoning, and Camille was its voice. She stood now, directly addressing the State Oversight Committee. The law was never meant to be a weapon for fear, she said, her voice steady, cutting through the silence like a sharpened truth. But for far too long, it has been one drawn first, questioned later, especially against those who look like me. What happened to me is not unique. It is systemic, predictable, and for some, fatal. Her words didn't tremble, but the gallery did. You could feel it, the weight of what she carried, not just in files and facts, but in generations of silence finally broken. I've read the complaints that were buried. I've met the mothers whose sons never came home. And I've seen the reports marked unsubstantiated with no review. That ends now. When she finished, the room didn't erupt in applause. It rose, slowly, as one. A standing ovation not for performance, but for truth. Even a few officers in uniform stood, heads low, faces thoughtful, the silence between them heavier than words. Ryan remained seated, hands clenched in his lap, the image of a man unraveling in front of a nation that finally saw him for what he was. His trial began 2 weeks later. The charges: unlawful arrest, falsifying police records, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations tied to the Whitaker case. The evidence: overwhelming. Witnesses testified, old footage resurfaced, patterns emerged like bruises under fluorescent light. But the most damning piece came from the courtroom screen, a single recovered dashcam video from the Clay County Archive, time-stamped and uncut. It showed Andre Whitaker, 17, terrified, holding a half-eaten sandwich and a school binder, as Ryan shouted commands with his weapon already drawn. The room went still when the shot echoed through the speakers, and it stayed still long after the screen went dark. Camille sat next to Andre's mother, gently holding her hand. No words were exchanged, none were needed when the jury returned. After only 4 hours of deliberation, the verdict echoed like a gavel dropped on stone. Guilty, on all counts. Ryan didn't cry, didn't speak, just stared at the wall behind the judge, blinking slowly, as if waking up from a dream that turned into a cage. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison, no parole, no bargaining. His badge was stripped, his pension revoked, and for the first time in over 2 decades, Officer McConnell had to walk out of a courtroom not as an enforcer of law, but as its consequence. Outside, the courthouse steps were packed with reporters, protesters, and supporters. But Camille didn't rush into the lights. She stood at the top, composed, while microphones reached toward her like open hands. Someone shouted, "Do you feel vindicated?" Another, "Is this justice?" She answered only once, clear and calm, "This isn't justice. This is the start of justice. Justice is when women like me don't need to carry law degrees to be believed, when boys like Andre never become hashtags, when a badge doesn't grant fear but earns trust. That's justice, and we're not there yet." Then she stepped down, slowly, purposefully, walking past flashing cameras, raised fists, and tearful eyes. She paused only once to hug Dana Whitaker, who held a framed photo of her son pressed to her chest like a shield made of memory. Camille whispered something only she could hear. Dana nodded. The moment was theirs. Camille didn't go home that night. She went to the Office of State Oversight, where a stack of reform proposals waited for her signature. New body cam protocols, updated officer psychological evaluations, civilian review boards, mandatory racial bias training. It was a mountain of work, but she was ready because the storm was over. And now it was time to rebuild brick by brick, law by law, and in the heart of it all stood a woman who once sat in handcuffs, breathing steady, eyes forward, refusing to be erased. Camille Foster had not just won a case. She had changed the terms of the silence, and in doing so, she'd reminded the world, power isn't what you hold, it's what you protect.